Making case studies accessible has more than one meaning. First, we want to make the process of creating a case study as transparent as possible, so they are an accessible genre for you all to write in. Second, we want to make the case studies themselves in their final forms as accessible to as many people as possible. And this presentation will cover both aspects of accessibility. No, case studies are an unfamiliar genre to many of us. They're shorter than most term papers, less formal than a lot of academic papers, and more multisensory than many more quote unquote conventional forms of interpretation are. I initially floundered when asked to write a case study, so I'm sure there is some confusion about the process. However, to hopefully simplify and streamline, all you need to start building a case study is a single source and something about it that intrigues you or puzzles you or even possibly annoys you. For example, in the case of this particular draft I'll be sharing here, I became interested in the history of tuberculosis and the Great Depression after reading a really fascinating memoir called The Plague and I by Betty McDonald. The book is noteworthy because it is hilarious. It's a surprisingly funny perspective on taking the rest cure for tuberculosis. And it provides a lot of really wonderful history about how gender, race, and socioeconomic class shaped people's experience of recovery from tuberculosis in that time period. So your selection point for a theme or a subject can really be as simple and as self-directed as that. Similarly, the research process can be largely dictated by what types of sources you particularly love working with. This slide features both examples of primary sources that one might utilize in the course of writing a case study and places where you might be able to access those primary sources. So for example, I often utilize ProQuest historical newspapers. If you have access to that database through your university library, it's fantastic. Newspapers.com, it is very unfortunate that it does require an account. I did the majority of my research using newspapers.com with a free trial account, so that is a possibility. Local historical societies often digitize community newspapers and are, generally speaking, quite receptive in terms of sending research queries. Photographs, you can find, obviously, Google Images, Library of Congress. Interviews or oral histories, you can conduct them yourself. I also recommend checking out the Disability History Association because that organization has sponsored a plethora of really interesting interview-based projects. Diaries and other kinds of textual resources. I often use HathiTrust. I often use the Internet Archive. The Internet Archive can be particularly great because it is such an incredible open access resource for researchers. Architectural renderings, the AIA archives, first place I usually look. Plans and elevations. Again, I usually try to find the architect in question's particular professional papers where they're kept and then email the archive directly. Historic film footage, which I love using. I have had the most success finding just via YouTube searches, through the Internet Archive. particularly for newsreels and that kind of thing, and sometimes Wikimedia Commons. Secondary source research, so this would be like academic articles drawn from journals or scholarly monographs, I think often feels more within our comfort zones, perhaps. So what I most wanted to draw attention to is the idea of the politics of citations. So this slide features a quote by Victor Ray in his piece, The Racial Politics of Citations. And the quote reads, quote, "Citations draw our attention to the ideas that supposedly matter. They are a measure of one's intellectual influence, and they shape what we are able to think about a given field. Citations, or lack thereof, bolster reputations and facilitate or exclude one from subsequent opportunities," end quote. So I include this here because, for example, in the case of the Milwaukee Ordnance Plant case study that focuses on deaf women's experience in the industrial workforce during World War II, I made a point of citing deaf scholars solely within the text. This kind of citational project has taken off in forms such as the Cite Black Women Project, or Women Also Know History. The Disability History Association has this incredible Zotero library of disability history scholars. I really recommend that you think critically about who you're citing, what perspectives you're amplifying via your citations, and what other kinds of perspectives it might be particularly meaningful for you to include within your case study. This pie chart just has a brief overview of the general breakdown of a case study in terms of word count. So if an average case study is approximately 2,000 words, the introduction, which includes the hook from a primary source to sort of draw a reader in, is approximately 15% of the text. The historical context that just lays the foundation for your case study site and tells the reader what they need to know to understand the site is about as long as the introduction. The analysis is the bulk of your case study's text, approximately 65%. And the conclusion, where you talk about future directions for the site, interpretive interventions you might suggest, or accessibility-based interventions you might suggest at a physical site, is the smallest section of your case study, usually clocking in at around 5% of your word count. Now, this pie chart is the time management portion of the presentation, because access, I think, also means making the process of writing a case study as transparent as is possible. So, for example, you can see here the different components of putting together a case study. So research, writing, formatting, rewriting, accessibility, and multimedia. You can see here that research and writing usually take me about the same amount of time. Finding multimedia, so that would be photographs, podcasts, videos, etc., usually takes me longer than conducting the usual kind of standard foundational research for the site. It's difficult sometimes to find particularly podcasts and videos that are accessible, and that can sometimes create more of a time-consuming process than one might initially expect. Building in accessibility measures like writing alt text, creating headers, checking to make sure that accessibility measures are actually working. Actually usually takes me more time than writing the initial draft of the case study, which I highlight to emphasize how important all of these digital accessibility measures are for producing this final product of the case study. Rewriting usually takes about 10% of the process time, and formatting the case study, which is slotting it into the very specific template that Repair, our collective, usually uses, takes less time, about 8% of the time budget. I did not break this down into specific hours because I think I do not intend to be prescriptive in any way in terms of like how many hours you should be spending on each of these components, but rather provide a sense of how much time in comparison to other components of the case study project each discrete component generally takes, at least me. Now moving into the second aspect of accessibility, building accessible case studies within story maps. So here we have a very, very rough case study draft. Shauna has provided a lot of insight into alt text, so I will not belabor that point here, but contrast, this aspect of accessibility is taken care of by Morgan's design. However, the color contrast of the title text, so the pines against the cover image, which they will appear overlapping within our template once it's published, is where we most usually run into contrast troubles, so that's something to bear in mind. Headings. Writing headings might not seem intuitive, but it's a lot, or even exactly like writing an outline for a paper or a speech. So you have your title, like here, The Pines, and then you have your main points in heading. So taking the rest cure, race and tuberculosis, gender and tuberculosis, treatment during the Great Depression. All of these are major points within the body of the case study. And here you can have your subheadings. So this breaks the major block of text into discrete chunks within that larger theme. So for example, a subheading for race and tuberculosis might be immigrants and the rest cure, because the process of accessing the rest cure was very different for United States citizens than it was for folks who immigrated, or Black Americans and their experience of the rest cure, often particularly in 1930s, 40s, 50s, tuberculosis sanitaria were extremely segregated, and that is an important thing to discuss and break down here. Lists were also a component mentioned within the 7 core skills, accessibility. You can see Story Maps provides this lovely bulleted list function. You can also have a numbered list. And really the primary point here is allow the scaffolding Story Maps has already built in for accessibility, allow that to support your work instead of kind of reinventing the wheel and working against the tide of the case study format. And finally, video and audio. Writing a transcript for a video can be slow going. There are services you can utilize through your university that can expedite the process for you, like Otter AI. However, what I usually do after I download a video that's uncaptioned to caption it is upload it privately to YouTube like this. You can upload your captions as a single block and then sync them to the video, or you can do so manually like this.
Just good, well-balanced.
And see the subtitles appearing here. I do recommend, if you have a full transcript already, just uploading it and then syncing it, which will be presented as an option to you here, instead of doing it manually, because doing it manually can be very time consuming. However, it is a way to guarantee that your captions are as correct and as useful as they can possibly be. And finally, let's show an example of building in a quote. You can come here to text, scroll down. Let's bring a text, a quote from Plague and I here. The quote I picked: I learned that a stiff test for friendship is, would she be pleasant to have TB with? Which provides a really good a good feeling for the general tone of Betty McDonald's memoir. So I hope this has been helpful. And if you have any questions about digital accessibility or the case study format, please feel free to let us know. Thank you.